Welcome aboard to the Captain Crypto Show. Today, we join the crew as they analyze some of the projects making waves on the high seas of cryptocurrency. Will those projects sink or will they sail? To find out, we join our host, Kylan Hurt.
Arr! Welcome back to the Captain Crypto Show. Tonight I'm pleased to introduce a new additional format to the show, one that I'm calling Sink or Sail. Oh, and in these episodes I'm going to be joined by some of my more qualified crew members as we choose projects and give our initial analysis. So in addition to my experience as a front-end engineer for Edge, formerly Airbits, filling out the crew tonight is Chief Architect of Edge, Mr. William Swanson. Welcome aboard, William.
Ahoy, Captain. Thank you for inviting me aboard your vessel. I look forward to examining the rigging of this here white paper to see if she be seaworthy.
I have a feeling that you're going to be a good fit on the show.
Arr.
So to kick off this new format, I had to kind of try to figure out which cryptocurrency or which blockchain-related project would be the best fit for the inaugural Sink or Sail episode. And one of the projects that I really didn't know very much about, but I had heard a lot of people kind of talking about it. There's a lot of gossip, a lot of buzz around it, I guess you could say, is a project called EOS. That's EOS. And EOS, it sounds like it's essentially the brainchild of a man by the name of Dan Larimer. And he's currently their CTO. And he is known for actually creating or helping to create both BitShares and Steemit. So he already has two fairly successful projects underneath his belt, and it sounds like he is ready to move on to the next step. So he is the CTO of a company called Block.one, and they are responsible for the development of the EOS.io software. That's officially what they call it. It's software that is going to be written, it is being written in WebAssembly and C++. And in addition to Dan Larimer, there are some other people on their team that are of note. For example, Brock Pierce is a co-founder, and he is obviously an advocate and avid supporter for the project. Some people might know him from within the blockchain community. He's very outspoken. He was an early adopter. And as a side note, he is a former child actor as well. So when I first started doing research into EOS, I really didn't know much of anything. All I really knew is that a lot of people seem to want to compare it to Ethereum and Neo and some of the other sort of platform types of projects. So I am kind of curious, William. I think you do have quite a bit of, maybe not quite a bit, but I know you are familiar with Ethereum. What has been your, experience with other projects that are more platform based within cryptocurrency?
Well, right. So, obviously Bitcoin was the very first thing that came out way back in the day. And into that Bitcoin, there was actually a little scripting language that you could use to kind of say, well, if I send this money to you, you have to answer the following question, solve the following riddle, have the following keys in order to spend that money. And that's pretty limited. So Ethereum came out, and I was actually really happy when I saw Ethereum came out because I wanted to see more advanced features. I wanted to see all these cool things people were talking about of like distributed autonomous organizations running in the cloud, doing things all by themselves.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like when they founded Ethereum, at least from my research, it seemed like they wanted to make things more programmable, more automated. Do you think that's kind of a simple way of referring to these sorts of platform projects?
Right. I think that's a fair way to say it. I agree that they succeeded in that. They actually did a really good job in the sense of they have a very powerful model that lets you do stuff in the cloud that would be very difficult to do with pure Bitcoin. But there's a downside to the Ethereum project, and that's that now you have these projects with these smart contracts sitting in the network, and their code always has bugs. I mean, you and I are both coders. We know that, right?
Mine has a lot of bugs, actually.
And yeah, our QA department finds them all the time, and we fix them, and then we ship. That's how life goes. Well, if you're on the blockchain, the QA department is the entire internet.
Right.
And the bug bounty, the prize for finding a bug is, however many millions of dollars worth of value are stored in your smart contract.
Right, and it's yeah, that's one way of putting it. That's an interesting, bug bounty is one way of putting it, and there are hackers that have definitely acquired those quote unquote bug bounties.
Yeah, the biggest one was the Dow hack. I mean, what was that, like $150 million or some crazy thing like that?
Yeah, there have been other ones that have been on that order of magnitude even within this last year as well. Yeah, so I think another issue, I guess one of the reasons that they have decided to take it upon themselves to create EOS was scalability. If you have something like Ethereum that was written at a time when maybe not many people were using blockchain technology, they were programming and maybe they didn't quite foresee how rapidly things would be successful and acquire more users. So it sounds like one of the main driving reasons for creating EOS was that they are trying to create a blockchain or a platform that can scale enough so that decentralized apps are able to work on the blockchain without there being too much of a bottleneck.
I agree with that. I think that's a big focus of this white paper.
Okay, so one of the more interesting things of note here, and this is actually critical to anyone who is an investor in EOS at this point, it is February 2018, and currently EOS, the currency symbol belongs to an ERC20 token, and that ERC20 token was actually launched by Block.one, and it was launched to help facilitate and help raise funds so that they could actually build out the official EOS.io blockchain. The official EOS blockchain has not yet launched. So if you guys are kind of connecting the dots here, if you have this ERC20 token, it's actually not going to be used on the EOS official blockchain. So what you have to do is if you actually do own EOS ERC20 tokens, before June of 2018, you have to make sure that you register them. That way, once the actual official EOS .io blockchain is launched, then you will be given coins or tokens on that new blockchain. So if you don't register them, I don't know exactly what happens if you don't register them. I don't know if there's a backup plan, but there's a risk that you won't be able to redeem your tokens on the new blockchain if you don't register your EOS tokens. So make sure you do that before June, otherwise you will have invested money in a token that has become worthless. So that is just a caution out there to all the listeners. Just make sure you register your tokens. So in general, when starting these Sink or Sail, these sort of analysis episodes, there was kind of the question of, okay, well, how do I want to structure it? And in a way, I think I'm kind of leaving that up to the actual projects themselves. The whole concept is revolving mostly around the white paper, because the white paper for each project is essentially that project's assertion of what they are going to do. So I think it makes sense for the format of these episodes to follow the actual official white papers themselves. So we're going to go ahead and dive in, and the first major section for the EOS white paper is consensus algorithm. EOS is going to be using an algorithm that is called delegated proof of stake. So this is in contrast to some of the current blockchains that are purely just proof of work. Now, by delegated proof of stake, that essentially means that if you hold coins or tokens on this new blockchain, you will be able to use those tokens to vote for what they call block producers. And I guess in a way, block producers are kind of analogous to miners, although that's very loosely putting it. And the amount that you vote for one of these block producers is weighed by the amount of tokens that you have. So as I understand it, they're looking to have 21 block producers at any given moment, and it sounds like they are aiming for 3-second blocks, which is very, very quick. That's an order of magnitude faster than or maybe even 2 orders of magnitude faster, depending on how you compare it to a lot of the current blockchains. So, William, what are your initial thoughts on their consensus algorithm and delegated proof of stake?
So I see where they're going with this. I mean, if you're trying to target a 3-second block time, which goes back to one of their goals for this project, which is they want to be fast. They want to be low latency. They want you to put your transaction out there and have it confirmed right away.
Right.
So if you want to target 3 seconds, you can't have a mining race for that block, because when you mine for blocks, everybody's kind of working in parallel trying to find the next block. 2 people find a block at the same time. Now you've got a confusion of who's block is the real block.
Right. They have to propagate through the network, and that takes time to go from node to node. They might be going at the speed of light, but they still have to get processed by the nodes. So when you're talking thousands, maybe even more of nodes, I could see how the propagation within proof of work can be an issue. But when you have delegated proof of stake, it sounds like you essentially have 21 main, as they call it, block producers creating the blocks.
Right. So the concept that they have here is we can't pick a new leader every 3 seconds. That's too fast. We couldn't agree on who the leader was in 3 seconds.
Right.
So what we're going to do is instead, 3 seconds times 21, that's about a minute, right? So once a minute, we'll pick a group of leaders, right? And then every 3 seconds, one of those people in that group has a chance to make a block. So we're just going to agree on the next minute, this is who's going to do what when. And then that's all goes down. And then the next minute we pick another set of leaders.
Okay, so that was a point of confusion for me because they have 21 block producers. They're looking for blocks 3 seconds. So when they're talking about, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, later they talk about executing or processing things in parallel. They're talking about in parallel, but still from that single block producer.
Right. So within a 3 second window, block goes out. You have to process all the messages, all the transactions in that block. So that they've designed it so that you can do that work on multiple CPU cores. So that the leader of that 3 second produces a block. Everybody gets a copy of the block. They all process it together, and then now they're finished it and they're ready for the next leader to produce the next block.
Right. And I think that makes more sense. So it's not 21 blocks per every 3 seconds. It's about 21 blocks, just like you said, a little bit over a minute.
Right. Now, one of the downsides of proof of stake is, of course, with proof of work, absolutely as a matter of fact that somebody spent electricity to make this block hash because there's no other way humans know of to make the kind of hashes we do in a proof of work system. But with a proof of stake system, the thing that says this guy was a leader was a consensus based on how much money he had. Well, how much money he had depends on the consensus of the previous blocks, right? So you kind of have this infinite rabbit hole.
It's a positive feedback system.
You're never quite sure, who really has the money and who's really making the rules. I mean, you could create like an echo chamber and fork somebody off, and they think that they're on a valid blockchain with miners producing, but it's all made up because you just gave yourself the money because you were the one, making the blocks.
Right, and that is probably the main concern that I usually hear about proof of stake. Even though this is delegated proof of stake, I don't know if there are any pure proof of stake systems out there yet, but there is a concern that to some extent, if you have a lot of these tokens, then you have more, how would I say it? There's more weight to your votes, and you can actually start becoming, you can produce more. So it's like the rich getting richer is kind of what I hear people call it.
That's an economic argument against it as well. I'm thinking more from the technical side of I can't do an SPV wallet on an EOS blockchain. So what SPV is a concept that Satoshi came up with way back, the very first original Bitcoin, was that I don't have to download every single transaction to see who's got what money. All I have to do is look at the proof of work, and then the proof of work tells me this person spent money to validate this transaction, therefore I know it's true. Whereas in a proof of stake system, you don't have that sort of absolute proof kind of standing by itself. It's all kind of based on past transaction history.
Right.
Now, it is delegated proof of stake. And what that means is if I have money and I want to make some income on that money, interest basically, I can delegate my staking rights to a mining pool. So that way I don't have to be the one running the mining server. I can let somebody else do it and I can collect the reward from that.
Right.
So one of the things that kind of comes out of this proof of stake system is within 21 miners producing blocks, I know who's supposed to go at each moment in time. So if there's 2 blocks produced that seem to conflict with each other, that would imply that somebody was cheating because they were supposed to produce 1 block in their time slot. So that means we're not going to have forks in the network because everybody agreed on who was supposed to produce what block when.
Okay, got it. Yeah, because when after I read the white paper, I was also asking people in the community about that, and they said, yeah, the way that it's set up makes it so that it's a little bit less adversarial between block producers, and therefore is less likely to fork.
Right.
Okay, so the next section is transaction as proof of stake, and essentially they're saying it sounds like that the way they have things set up make it less likely that there will be counterfeit transactions going on. I'll be honest, I didn't fully understand this section, but what was your take on this, William?
Right. So what they're saying is if I'm going to transmit a transaction, like I'm going to spend money, I'm going to send money from me to you, I actually have to know what a recent block hash is and include that in my transaction. And that does two things. One is it says if the network goes on a fork, right? Someone decides to arbitrarily fork the network. I will only have my money sent to you on the fork that I chose because I actually said what headers were in it.
Okay.
And then the other thing it does, well, they say it does, is that it makes the fork have more weight because there's more transactions in it, and that kind of proves that it's more valuable. But I don't
it's
actually
kind of like the longer chain, right?
Yeah, but I don't actually think that makes much difference. I think really what you should be looking at is how much stake was on it, because the transactions going on it, they don't really add much to it.
Right. And one thing that kind of, I'm not going to say it raised a red flag, but when they say, oh, of a recent block, to me, I'm immediately thinking, okay, what does recent even mean? This is a world, I mean, we're in cryptocurrency where it's a world of numbers. I don't know, can recent mean from the last, from one of the last 21 blocks, or?
If I was coding it up, I'd say something in the last 5 minutes or something, something like that might be appropriate. That way it proves that, you want the fork you're on, and in the last 5 minutes, nobody's hard forked the network at least.
Okay, got it. Okay, so the next section is called accounts, and I actually found this feature within EOS pretty interesting. And there's kind of a recurring theme within EOS that they, at least the way I would put it, is they're kind of like putting training wheels on the blockchain, if that makes sense. They're essentially creating a framework, for lack of a better term, and they are providing certain tools on the platform layer to make it easier for people who are developing applications. And one of the main things that they've done, they've made it easy for people to create an actual account. So like an actual EOS domain account, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like having either a website domain or maybe an email address, if you will, as well. And it can be between 2 and 32 characters. And I think if this is something where the EOS blockchain does start to get very popular, some of those there might be some domain names that are actually going to be very, what would I say, expensive or lucrative. So there might be a little bit of a land grab in the beginning, and it sounds like they want people to be able to use the same account between the different decentralized apps that are built on the EOS blockchain. What were your thoughts when you saw kind of what they were trying to do with accounts?
Right. So in Bitcoin, we have horrible addresses like 19Z88Q, whatever. And so people have been trying for a long time to come up with some way to give like you an email handle or some phone number or something that's like a short thing that represents you. A lot of systems exist that do it, but there's no one single system. So whenever I send money to someone using Bitcoin, it's basically scanning a barcode with some hideous code inside of it. Their idea is, no, we're not going to have addresses. We're just going to have accounts that have human readable names. So a human readable name built right into the blockchain would basically solve that problem for EOS's users.
Right. And it would certainly make things more memorable as well. So instead of having to try to memorize someone's public address, it would just be something like, let's say, Captain Crypto Show or something like that. It would make it more easier to remember. And I guess this is a good time for me to point out that one of the recurring themes as well with EOS is that they're not going for privacy. So if you're looking for a privacy coin or platform, EOS is definitely not it. This is one where Dan Larimer himself has said they want things to be public. They want to push the space toward being more transparent. So this is definitely how would I say it, in line with that sort of mentality.
And in order to do this technologically, they have to kind of bend over backwards, because on the Bitcoin network, the random code that you have is actually cryptographically linked to your private key. Whereas here, if you have a user readable name, there's no cryptographic linkage. So they have to actually have a different system in place for how do you associate keys to accounts, which is actually fairly interesting.
Yeah, and that's actually the next section here in the white paper, role-based permission management. So this is fairly interesting. They have a bit of I guess you could call it like a hierarchy. And I have seen certain things that are similar in some of the previous Dan Larimer projects, like Steemit, I think has something similar where there are different permissions, different levels of permissions to, like I said, a hierarchy to help you kind of manage accounts and manage applications. So what were your thoughts on these permissions? Do you think, is this something that maybe is too strict, or do you think it lends to usability or makes it easier for developers to create apps?
I think you can do everything that they're saying here on Ethereum, on Bitcoin, using the appropriate, scripts and smart contracts and things. That's all available. Nothing here is particularly new. What's different about it is that they've actually baked it into the
platform,
Yeah, into the blockchain. So it's not like on Ethereum where I have to create a smart contract that represents a multi-sig.
Right.
It's they just kind of have it built in as part of their authentication, I guess.
Right, and so it's almost like a tool for developers to use, right?
It is. And I think part of the reason they're doing this is because if you have an Ethereum smart contract sitting out there, there's nobody who owns it, nobody who controls it. It's kind of autonomous. Whereas here they're thinking, well, no, we don't want autonomous code sitting out there. There is no such thing as a smart contract kind of running independently. There's just users with named accounts. So if I built a smart contract, I would create an account with a name, and I would put the code into that account. And then I would give it permission saying, only 5 of the 6 foundation members can upgrade the source code for this thing. And, it can only send money out under these conditions and all these sorts of things based on the permissions system. And that's not part of the contract's code. It's actually part of the account setup.
Right. And it sounds like you can make the roles and permissions almost as complicated as you would like. So if you're in a big organization and you want to set up all sorts of rules for who can do what, and, do they need multiple signatures, for example, then they do kind of have a framework for even extending on what they already have with the baked-in permissions and roles. And I thought this was kind of interesting because it does allow, for example, to prevent or to help protect people and help – I'm trying to think of the term – to help people recover, lost funds or lost accounts. So, for example, I believe there's something where you can kind of delegate someone so that in the case that you lose your account, they can actually help you get your account back. And it sounds like there is kind of like a basic private key, but in general, that private key is for cold storage. That private key can give active roles, which are kind of like the level under the private key, or I guess you could call it the owner. So the active roles are right under the owner. And that way, by keeping the private key or the owner key in cold storage, that helps protect people. So they're only using, for the most part, active roles. Do you think something like that is helpful?
I think none of this stuff is new. We've had this in Bitcoin. We've had this in Ethereum for years, right? But the problem is nobody uses it. I wonder if by having it directly in the platform, it encourages people to actually use it. And I would expect that EOS is going to come up with some kind of a GUI or an interface to interact with their blockchain. And I'm guessing that they'll put this sort of feature into that user interface.
So what do you think the reason is for people not using it on Ethereum, for example? Is it something where because it's not in the platform, you'd have to use some third-party application?
It's extra work, basically, at that point.
Right. And is it something where someone would have to do that work for every application, or does it – because why hasn't someone stepped up and made sort of like a framework, a framework for permissions that other people can use on Ethereum?
If you want to do permissions on Ethereum, you have to make a smart contract, which represents your group of people. That smart contract is going to be autonomous. It's going to run on the blockchain by itself. And then you all provide your input telling the smart contract what to do on your behalf. So from a technical point of view, that's more of a complicated setup, and you now have this smart contract code that can get broken, and we saw that happen. One of the multi-sig smart contracts from a very well-respected wallet was actually hacked, and the money got locked up. So I think there's actually almost more of a risk on an Ethereum system, whereas here what they're doing is actually baking it into the blockchain, which is kind of scary in the sense that it makes the blockchain way more complicated.
Yeah.
But it's also kind of awesome because now you don't have a bunch of people reinventing the wheel. You've done it one time, hopefully correctly, and then,
and it's created by the people who built the blockchain too. So hopefully that would lend to some credibility, right?
Right. And you're not running arbitrary code. It's kind of very simple permissions, 5 out of 4 or 3 out of 2 or this one or that one. There's sort of evaluating a matrix, like a graph of like who can do what is an awful lot simpler and less risky than evaluating an arbitrary program that can do anything.
Right. So with regards to permissions and roles, I know I was talking a little bit earlier about how they are trying to protect people's accounts. They do have something where you are actually able to send messages. They call them messages, but essentially have actions that are executed. But you can also have like a 72-hour clearing period So essentially, you could make it so that if certain actions are done with your account, there could be an automatic delay. So that way, you could actually know that this action is occurring, just in case someone else has control of your owner role and is actually trying to maliciously attack your own account. So you hypothetically would have the ability to intercept that action before it actually gets executed. So that was one thing where that's part of the recurring theme of them trying to protect accounts. And another thing is if someone does lose control of their account, I know I mentioned this earlier, but you can have someone who is a delegate that helps you recover the account. But the good thing also is that delegate, other than helping you recover the account, they don't necessarily have to have any permissions to your account. So it is something where they are trying to help you delegate someone that you trust that can later help you recover your account. Okay, so one of the more technical aspects of EOS is actually part of the next section, which is deterministic parallel execution of applications. And obviously, this is a very technical topic. From what I can gather, it sounds like they are trying to make the blockchain work in a way so that whoever is the block producer will be able to maximize the amount of transactions that can go on in each block. Then that means, to a certain extent, making sure that transactions, if they affect, how would I say it, so that the order in which they are being processed doesn't affect the outcome. Is that a proper way of saying it?
So one of the things that we have in the history of computer science is, at first, computers just got faster, right? We had 1 megahertz CPUs way back in the 80s, and then we had 4 and 5, and then 100 megahertz, gigahertz. At some point, CPUs just stopped getting faster.
Right.
So the way we made computers go faster was to have more CPUs just running in parallel with each other. So, I mean, you can't hardly get a laptop anymore without like 8 different processors inside of it,
Right, like 8 cores.
Yeah. So if you're going to design a system and you want to take advantage of modern computing hardware, you need to be able to split the work apart into like 8 independent pieces that don't depend on any of the other pieces, so that each core can have a piece and work on it independently of the others.
Right. So it's kind of like horizontal scaling, so to speak.
Right. So if you have a blockchain where one message gets sent to an account and that does some work, and then in response to that, it sends another message to another account, those things can chain up. And the only way you can do it is you have to evaluate the first one, then evaluate the second one, then evaluate the third one. So you're kind of stuck doing it in order, and you can't split that across multiple cores.
Right, so it's almost like hopefully people will write applications that take advantage of the horizontal scaling, and it sounds like probably the algorithms that will be used by the block producers will automatically, I guess you could say, split things up, right?
So what they have is this concept of something called a cycle. And the idea is that within a single block, the person who's doing the mining will find a bunch of transactions that aren't related to each other, right? Bob pays Alice, and meanwhile, Sue pays Sally, whatever. Those two don't depend on each other, so we can put those together at the same time. That means I can put them to separate CPU cores, and then once we've finished with all those things that don't depend on each other, we stop, and then we go on to the next wave, the next cycle, I guess, and then that would again have more things that don't depend on each other. So that way, even if individual messages don't depend on each other, if between cycles, you can have dependencies.
Right. So, and it sounds like they call them messages, or these sort of actions or transactions that do affect each other will probably be within the same cycle. Is that correct?
So if I'm sending money from me to you, and then you're sending it on to someone else, that has to be split across 2 cycles, right? First, my money to you, and then in response, your money to somebody else.
Okay.
So that would be across cycles. But if we're doing that, somebody else could be parallel doing, some completely unrelated thing, and that could go in the same cycle with ours.
What if it was something where it's just between me and you?
If it was just one single transaction, then it can go anywhere.
Well, let's say it's multiple. Let's say it's kind of like almost like we have a ledger. I send you $10, and then you send me $5. I guess if that was in the same block, I don't know if that would make much sense.
If that was in the same block, and it can be, those would have to be across cycles because they depend on each other, one's after the other, right?
Okay.
So another thing that they do have in order to make that easier is atomic transactions. So what that means is if I'm going to do a transaction where I send money to 5 different people,
right,
that has to go through all at once or not at all.
Right.
So it can't kind of go halfway through where I send money to 4 of the people, the 5th person crashes or doesn't work correctly.
Or there's not enough money.
Or there's whatever, right? It either goes all through or not through. So that actually is kind of a protection in this kind of parallel world. So this is an interesting approach to scaling because what they're trying to do is basically it's in a form of massive on-chain scaling.
Right.
They want to have blocks come in really fast, and they want to allow the blocks to get really big and just be able to cram that down to powerful CPU or multiple CPUs actually, and just have everything on chain. And it's interesting, that is not necessarily the approach that a lot of projects are taking.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like obviously the initial concern would be, okay, will this blockchain end up being full of bloat? Will it get too big too quickly, right?
Right. If you have, gigabytes of data every day coming in, that's going to be a fast-growing chain. The other thing is, I mean, if you want to run a full node, you should probably have enough CPU cores to handle these 3-second blocks with all these transactions in them.
Right.
Other projects like Bitcoin are talking about things like Lightning Network, which are second layer solutions because we don't want to run everything on the blockchain. We want to kind of get off the blockchain and do things somewhere else where it's cheaper and faster. Right. It's interesting. I actually am very excited to see more on-chain scaling. Let's see how fast blockchains can go and where the limits are, right?
Right.
If we have a blockchain that goes gigabyte blocks every day or whatever it is, and we run into problems, that's actually very interesting information that we can use, further on, because the way we learn is by trying things and seeing if they work or not.
Yeah, I think you're seeing a lot of that with Bitcoin Cash, where it sounds like they're trying to push the limits of on-chain scaling. So yeah, you do have different scaling solutions, and in all honesty, maybe you'll be able to do a little bit of both or multiple solutions. One thing that I found I thought was kind of clever with EOS was they were saying that, okay, if you have different nodes that are looking at the blockchain, maybe some of them will just be application specific. Maybe because if let's say I want to run a node and let's say I'm mostly interested in a certain application on how would I say it, on the EOS blockchain. They're saying you can essentially, as I understand it, you can have that node mostly just look at transactions that affect that app, and that way you wouldn't have to carry all the bloat of all the other applications.
They do talk about that. I'm not quite sure how they plan to do it. It's kind of a vague section, but it does hint that they're trying to figure out ways to make that possible.
Yeah, I could see it being difficult to figure out, okay, well, how do you decide where one application ends and the next begins?
Right. You want to send me $10 to pay for this movie? Well, I'm running the movie application, but I don't know if you have $10 because I didn't, check the casino application we got the $10 for.
Right.
So there could be some problems there, but I think if they can make that work, that'd be very impressive.
For those of ye out there enjoying the show, your captain would love to get some feedback on how best to improve it. You can find me on Twitter as Captain Crypto HD, and on most of the high seas of social media as either Captain Crypto or Captain Crypto Show. Just be on the lookout for my logo. Also, be aware that due to the technical aspects of each platform, that my podcast feed will always have the most up-to-date and latest revisions of each episode. So if you're enjoying this episode, feel free to give your old captain a review on iTunes and share this episode with the rest of your crew. Now, back to the show.
Okay, so the next topic is the token model and resource usage. And here when we're talking about tokens, kind of like we're talking about coins, we're actually talking about the native units that will be on the official EOS.io blockchain. So it sounds like, since this is proof of stake, so I think this kind of goes along with it, if someone wants to run a decentralized app, they're probably going to have quite a bit of tokens, and it sounds like these tokens will give you a portion, I guess you could almost call it like a bandwidth, but essentially you get a portion of the processing power that is proportional to the actual tokens that you're holding compared to everyone else's.
Right. So a normal blockchain, you have mining fees basically to pay for your resource usage. If I want to send a transaction, I pay so many fees that goes to the miner, and that prevents spam, because if you have to send millions of transactions, I have to have millions of fees, and that's going to limit me. Whereas here they're saying, no, actually, you hold these tokens, which are basically your privilege to send messages. And as long as you're holding the token, you're allowed to send messages as much as you like, up to however many per second that token gives you. So
right. So I guess that would that mean then that how powerful your portion of the blockchain processing power would also be dependent on how powerful the network is in general. Is that correct?
I'm not quite sure how that scales. It's not really made clear in the paper.
Yeah, because if it's something where it's just a portion of, how would I say, of a single block producer at any given point, I could see that being a little bit of an issue because you're talking about essentially only one computer at a time, I would think.
So what they make a distinction here, and this I think is an important distinction between objective and subjective measurements. So in Ethereum, they try to actually account for every single cycle of CPU usage, every single byte of RAM. They're charging you for that. Whereas in this EOS project, what they're saying is, we don't know how to account for that. We have no way of coming up with an accurate, for all of time, like system in the consensus algorithm. So what we're going to do is instead say, the miners get to choose, based on when they're running the smart contract, I feel like you've used enough time, you're done, now I'm going to run someone else's.
Right.
So it's all kind of fuzzy. They don't really clearly lay out, what one token's going to buy you in terms of CPU or RAM or whatever. But they do say there's some objective measurements, like how many messages you send per second. So maybe if I hold one EOS token, that authorizes me to send one message per day. So I could transmit money to one person per day or activate one smart contract per day. And if I want to do more than one per day, I got to hold two tokens. That gives me two messages.
Two per day, right?
Yeah, right. And then maybe the same, they also say for storage, right? So if my smart contract is storing data, then maybe there's like so many tokens per megabyte or whatever for the storage.
So I'm curious then, your initial thoughts on this. Do you think it is a step in the right direction or that it is feasible for this specific area? Specifically how your stake or your proportion of tokens will give you more, I don't want to say just processing power, because it can also be bandwidth, storage, RAM.
I think it's an experimental model. I don't think we've seen a system like this in production on a blockchain. So I'm kind of interested to see how it works. If it works the way we think it does, then that'd be pretty cool. Obviously, mining rewards are really primitive, right? Like you pay for what you use as you use it.
Right.
Versus kind of like the monthly subscription model. So it's like I can go to Redbox and rent one DVD, or I can go to Netflix and have a subscription and I can watch all I want, but they're kind of banking on the fact that on average, nobody's watching movies all day long and like costing more than the next guy next to him.
Right. So I'm curious then, on this part, they are also saying that this is kind of a move. It kind of moves the fees more to the application layer. I was curious what your thoughts are on that. It sounds like it is a little bit of a move to get more users, but then also if the people running the applications are taking on the cost, then hypothetically that could it would disincentivize people who are building apps to build on this blockchain. But I think what they're arguing is that it's ultimately going to help bring users to those apps. So it ends up being a net positive for the application developers.
Right. So in a world without mining fees, sending money, if I've got money, that means I have tokens, I can send them. So that's kind of taking care of for itself. For an application developer, the more people are using my thing, presumably I'm doing well, I'm making money, I've got some sort of profits built into that.
Right.
If I'm building a site or some kind of an ICO project, presumably I have a way of making money.
Right. And I guess hypothetically on the application layer, the developers could try to find a way to charge the users, right? So technically there's nothing stopping application
So if I have a way of making money, then I can obviously buy these tokens that allow me to have bandwidth for my thing to run. Like CryptoKitties, right? How much money do those guys make? They can obviously, if they were to run it on an EOS, they could obviously afford all the tokens they needed to keep their system running.
Right. So one thing that did raise my eyebrow a bit was, and this is the next title, or excuse me, the next section's community benefit applications. And it sounds like the blockchain has something baked in where I guess part of there are some resources that will go toward specific projects that are, I guess, elected by the community or something like that. What are your thoughts on these community benefit applications?
Well, this is the model that the Dash kind of really brought to the forefront is, we're going to launch a blockchain and some portion of the mining reward, and in the case of EOS, it's about 5%, goes to us, the founders of the blockchain, and we'll use that money to pump the blockchain. We'll use it to pay developers to build new apps. We'll use the money to basically improve the community and the
do some
environment.
marketing as well.
Yeah, lots of marketing.
Do you like seeing those sorts of features on a blockchain? Because I'll be honest, my initial reaction when I hear it is like, oh, okay, so this is a slush fund, and who knows where this money is going to be going? Like, are people really going to be keeping a close eye on it? Because there have been instances where other projects have had some funds go to something that was elected or voted on, and some of those funds, maybe there's some backlash as to how they were used. So what in general, when you see a project that has something like this, what are your thoughts?
This is kind of one of the things that I see as being a little bit of a red flag in a project. I'm not going to say every project that does this is evil, but it is kind of a red flag for me, because one of the things that we want in a blockchain is, freedom. We want to, get less centralization. We want to have less leadership. We want to be able to just kind of run things like an ant colony and less like a top-down, command and control. And when you build a thing like this in, you're basically saying, no, we're choosing top-down command and control, right? This is money going to certain people who are in charge of the project, presumably, and who are going to set a direction. And they're basically kind of built-in kings, right?
That's what I was thinking. They're kingmakers. If you have a lot of stake, then you can kind of pick and choose certain projects that will be very well funded. That sounds a lot like a kingmaker sort of role.
Yeah, kind of like you got the oligarchs who are your stakers, who have lots of value. They're voting for the leader, the king, and then he's kind of running the show, developing technological stuff. If you're hiring developers as the leader, now you're setting the direction of the project. So it's a feedback loop.
Yeah, and a lot of people argue, oh, well, if you don't have something like this, then some of the projects are just going to be so hard for them to find funding. But there have been definitely several projects out there, or blockchains, I guess I should say, that have found other ways to do it. For example, Monero, they don't have any baked-in rewards. It's just if someone... They have not a forum, I don't remember the exact term for it, but they do have kind of like a board where people can post their projects and say, this is how much I want, and the community themselves decide whether they want to donate or not. So it's not baked in, it's more voluntary. And I think it's absolutely been very successful. So it makes me wonder why something like this community benefit applications is really even necessary.
Right. And especially because EOS is an ICO, the way an ICO is supposed to work is you send out some portion of the money to the world and you get your funding to develop the project. And then if the project is successful, the portion of the funds you kept becomes more valuable because the network's more valuable.
Right.
And then that should keep you alive and floating. As long as you're adding value, you're getting paid. That the whole concept of a war chest ICO is that you're just increasing the value all the time, and there's your built-in revenue stream.
Right.
The other way you could do it is just to say, no, the people who are using the project are who pay for it. So like on Bitcoin or anything like that, there's lots of companies hiring developers to work on Bitcoin stuff all the time because they're wallet providers, they're exchanges, they're merchants, providers. All these companies who are benefiting from the network are paying developers to enhance it. That's how Linux came to be.
Yeah, that's definitely a very sort of, I guess you could call it open source sort of way of doing things. And I think it's one that's been successful. I mean, even at Edge, when we when we improve on something, a lot of times we try to offer that improvement back to the underlying developers so that they can incorporate it, because that way the community, I guess you could call it, organically grows and improves.
Right. I mean, that's how Linux, like I said, Linus Torvalds threw this thing out there. It wasn't very useful. Some people came on, they started working on it. Companies started integrating into their products. And of course, as soon as you've got it in your product, you need to support it. So you hired engineers, and now you have thousands of engineers, or probably at least hundreds in the very core of it, who are kernel developers building Linux, and everybody benefits from their work.
Right.
And companies like Google are throwing millions of dollars at Linux, every year because they need it to power their phones.
Right. So I guess while some of the positive effects of having more control over, over accounts and roles within the EOS blockchain, there can be a lot of positive stuff that can be done. There are some things that that also raise an eyebrow. For example, it looks like they have the ability to freeze accounts. So I think hypothetically they're probably thinking, okay, if there's a major hack, they want a way that's baked in that they are able to freeze the accounts that are affected by that hack and maybe the account that has, let's say, acquired those funds. And if they're able to get 17 out of 21, so a super majority of the block producers at that time to agree, then they do have the ability to freeze that account and ones that are, how would I say it, related to it or affected by it.
Right. So the concept is, in Ethereum, we had the DAO hack, right? Millions of dollars were lost, and they all went to this one account. We don't know who controlled it, but somebody had that money, and we saw it move there. So after the fact, instead of hard forking the whole network in order to undo that problem, the miners could all agree to say, now 17 out of 21 of us agree that we're simply going to freeze that guy's money. Gone. So he stole the money, and now it's frozen. So it's not good in the sense that the DAO still got hacked and everybody lost their money, but at least now the hacker doesn't have millions of dollars to play with, right?
Right.
He loses his reward. So the idea is that it would lower the incentive on hacking, but it won't eliminate hacking.
Yeah, and unfortunately, this is a very short section, but I'm thinking, okay, if I hack something, then maybe immediately I'm already starting to send money around. Maybe there are places that you can pay for stuff with EOS, and all of a sudden they're taking these funds too. And this is in the moments immediately after the hack. My concern then is, okay, if you start freezing accounts, it sounds like you're going to have to freeze every account that I spend money to. And how do you know whether an exploit or something has happened? There's a big, if minutes have gone by, then that money could have already gone
laundered.
into it. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So to me, that's my immediate concern there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect system, and I think it in reality, we'll see how it plays out, but I don't really think it's going to work as well as they think it will. I mean, yeah, if somebody's on Ethereum and they move it to one address, he just assumes it's going to be safe there because there's no ability to freeze accounts. But if I'm on EOS, I know it's going to get frozen, so I'm going to do everything I can to spread it around.
Right, and how do you detect an exploit? And then not just do you have to detect it, but you have to convince the supermajority of block producers as quickly as possible that this exploit happens so you can start freezing the account. So I have a feeling this one at some point will get tested out. If enough people are using this blockchain, this will get tested. And this is it'll be very interesting to see how it works.
Oh, yeah. And what's to say that 17 out of 21 don't decide, oh, let's go and freeze our competitor's project because we have a lot of money and they don't, and we're just going to shut them down.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, if the luck of the draw gives, somebody who has a lot of tokens a lot of mining stake, they might just decide to shut down some competitor or something.
Yeah, if there's ever any sort of centralization within the block producers, things could become an issue. I guess people vote on it, but maybe you don't always know who's behind each block producing
each
node.
random address or whatever. Well, that wouldn't be random addresses; they'd be names, but they could be random usernames too.
Right.
Who is Joe 5216? I don't know.
Right. So the next section is actually pretty closely related, in my opinion. Changing the account code. So if you same magic number 17 out of 21, if they decide that there is something wrong with an account, or I guess with a smart contract, they do have the ability to change code. I think change code within that smart contract. At least that's how I read it.
Yeah, that seems to be what they're saying. So not only can you freeze accounts, but you can also change the code on accounts. And I guess changing the code is the equivalent to freezing, right? I mean,
it's very similar.
If I say, oh, here's an account that I don't want to spend any more money, I just change the code so that it's not allowed to spend money,
Right. Yeah, so this is definitely, like I said, it's related. And honestly, there's a part of me that doesn't really as long as they are able to prevent centralization and collusion for malicious reasons, which is a big if, right? I mean, that's part of the paradigm that is blockchain technology. But if they are able to keep a more natural and a well-intentioned group of block producers, then I think this could end up being a good thing. I'm sure there will be plenty of instances where this is good, because there are times where people see a smart contract and they look at it and they realize that there's a flaw, and they're just thinking, if I can't change this, it's just a matter of time before it gets exploited. So that is something where they are using a solution that's very different from Ethereum.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next section is even more technical than some of the earlier ones. It's about scripts and virtual machines. And I'll be honest, I am a front-end developer, but that's front-end development. So some of this stuff starts to get a little bit too technical for me. So William, why don't you give us an idea of what they're talking about in this section?
So when we're talking about smart contracts, we're talking about code, essentially,
Right.
things that run on a computer. And the question is, what is that code written in? How does that code actually execute? And traditionally, in Ethereum, they've used their own programming language called Solidity,
Right.
which compiles down to something called the EVM, the Ethereum Virtual Machine. So they had to invent a whole new programming language and a whole new computing model, basically, to represent these smart contracts.
Right.
I think EOS is saying, well, why limit ourselves to this weird language and this weird model? Why don't we open ourselves up and allow WebAssembly, which is actually another similar thing that's been invented for the web. And WebAssembly is great because lots of people are using it. The internet's big. So you have all kinds of programming languages compiling down into WebAssembly. So I can write my program in Rust. I can write it in JavaScript. I can write it in all kinds of languages that compile into WebAssembly. So now I can write smart contracts any way I feel like.
So the idea is that since something like WebAssembly is more tried and true, that there's hopefully less exploits that can occur, less vulnerabilities than something like Solidity.
I think it's not so much about the exploits and the vulnerabilities. Personally, I would say the EVM and WebAssembly are probably about equal in terms of exploitability at the machine level.
Okay.
I think what it comes down to is tooling, right? What programming language are we forcing developers to use when they build these contracts?
Okay. So if with this one, you're like you said, you're choosing one that there are already developers for.
There's already developers who know how to use it. There's already tools that know how to build for it. Like there's a whole ecosystem out there ready to go. You just got to glob onto it.
So, and I can see this is maybe them looking out for their own blockchain a little bit, because something like Ethereum, everyone's looking for Solidity developers, and there just aren't very many out there. So there aren't as many decentralized apps being built. But maybe if you choose a language that is more common, there are more developers out there, then you are more likely to have these developers build apps on your blockchain. Is that the thinking?
That's the thinking, right? So you can hire any old C developer now. C is a pretty common programming language, and
Right.
now all of a sudden they can target WebAssembly and get your smart contract built.
Okay.
So one interesting feature that they have in this EOS thing, I mean, they really have the kitchen sink packed into this, let me tell you. But one of the things they have is inter-blockchain communication. So the idea is EOS is going to understand a way to put proofs in that a transaction has happened on another network. So if I send money to you on Bitcoin, I can then put a proof of that onto EOS to say, look, I paid him the Bitcoin, and therefore the smart contract can do something in response to that. So one of the applications might be something like a decentralized exchange. Like I sent you some Bitcoin, therefore the smart contract will release to me the equivalent amount of EOS for what I just bought with Bitcoin.
Yeah, and I guess that is relevant to this, the time of this recording of this podcast, because I know Bitfinex, which I think is the largest exchange in the world, or one of the biggest, they actually announced recently what they're calling EOS Finex. So it sounds like people are already targeting the EOS blockchain to create a decentralized exchange, which is one of those holy grails that everyone in the space is hoping for. So it sounds like they are going to be using this concept. Maybe they're already starting to build it. Is this something that's new? This is not completely new, right? I have seen at least in other white papers it being mentioned that, interactivity between blockchains.
A lot of people are talking about interactivity between blockchains, and the traditional approach that's used by things like Ripple and Waves is to have a gateway. So the gateway is a computer that's connected to both the Waves network and the Bitcoin network, say. So when I send Bitcoin to the gateway then issues an equivalent amount of Bitcoin representative tokens
Right.
on the Waves network, and then I can trade those around and move them back out through the gateway back into the real Bitcoin.
So it's like an extra layer in between the two blockchains.
Right.
Whereas this would be something that's a little more direct.
Kind of like more built in. The bad thing, I guess it's kind of good and bad. A gateway can actually store funds. So if I send Bitcoin into the Waves network, I actually send it to the gateway holds the funds.
Right.
And then the gateway can release them later. Well, now if the gateway gets hacked, that's an exchange hack and the funds are stolen.
Right.
So it's kind of got pros and cons. So in a system like this with proof of transactions happening on other chains, like what EOS is doing, EOS itself won't be able to store Bitcoin. I can send Bitcoin to you and prove that I did it,
Right.
but I can't actually send Bitcoin to EOS and have like an EOS exchange like holding my Bitcoin for me, like in an account.
So what is the, how would I say it? So what does that mean for someone building a decentralized exchange? Does that mean that this sort of, how would I say it, that this inter-blockchain communication would make things easier or harder? Or
So it means that if you're building a decentralized exchange, you can't like upload money to the exchange, have it sit there and place your orders kind of offline.
Right.
It's actually more of a peer-to-peer, more like a local Bitcoins type of an exchange.
Does that make it harder to like do timing, do you think, or not really?
It makes it more difficult to build like a trading exchange where people are, putting their stop and limit orders on the order book.
Right.
It's more like a local Bitcoins where it's like, hey, Kylan, would you like to buy some Bitcoin? Oh, sure. I'll pay you this much Litecoin for it. It's like, okay, we agree on a plan. And then I prove that I sent you the Bitcoin. And then, you prove that I sent the Litecoin, and then we're settled.
So there needs to be some coordination, I guess is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Or you could use maybe some sort of decentralized app. Well, I guess that's what the exchange would be.
Right.
But at that point, it's like, okay, maybe would the exchange even be fully decentralized? What are we talking? What level of decentralization becomes a big question, right?
Right. So it would be fully decentralized. I think you could build a fully decentralized exchange. But I guess my point is one of the critical features, I don't know if you do any day trading.
It's not my thing.
Yeah. But if you go onto an exchange like a GDAX or whatever, I can put a limit in that says, I will sell this Bitcoin for dollars once the price reaches 12K, right?
Right.
The price
Limit order or something.
The price is below that today.
Right.
So the order just sits there on the books a day, a week, a month, a year later, it triggers, and now I've got my dollars.
Right.
And you can't do something like that as easily on a thing like EOS because EOS can't hold funds. It just proves that they move. So
okay, I think that makes more sense.
So like if I put my Bitcoin up for deposit and say I want to sell it, and when the price hits a certain level, who's holding that Bitcoin during the next year?
Right.
That's the problem. You kind of have to still have that other component.
Okay, so now that we've reached the conclusion of the white paper, we've tried to hold off on our opinions, our holistic opinions of this project. And you are the new one here, so I'll let you start off. What do you think of EOS? Is it something? I know you're not. Maybe I don't know if you do a lot of trading. Would you hold the tokens, or perhaps more importantly, you're a developer? Would you ever consider developing upon the EOS blockchain?
I think EOS is a very interesting project. I think compared to Ethereum, it's got some things it's trying to get better, right? It's trying to get the account security better in the sense that I can now change my smart contract after it's deployed. That's big. It also has some red flags in that same vein, right? Like if I'm trying to build a smart contract, how do I know I'm not going to get shut down by the miners, right?
Right.
And what about that, 5% going to the slush fund? There's some things about it that make me kind of nervous from a freedom point of view, but they kind of make sense from a security point of view. So I do think there's a mixed bag here in terms of being better than Ethereum and then in some ways being worse.
Yeah, and I think I'll be honest, I'm fairly optimistic about it because they have been able to learn from the mistakes, so to speak, of Ethereum. And I guess you could say, since it's later, technology has also, matured. But with the recurring theme of them kind of making it more of like a framework, whereas I guess Ethereum is more of like an open sandbox, I actually will be honest, I do like a lot of those features. I'm maybe not super happy about freezing accounts, but on the other hand, if you enter the EOS blockchain or you're writing apps on it, if you go in kind of already knowing that those things are there, then if they do freeze an account, well, okay, buyer beware, right? There is a certain argument there. And one thing that does concern me a little bit is when they're adding all these features, there's a question of whether an additional amount of complexity will make it more vulnerable. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Right. So the Bitcoin network is considered to be fairly simple in terms of these like generation 3 blockchains, and there's already a lot of debate and frustration and headache in terms of just what does the Bitcoin consensus even mean?
Right.
And I don't even know what EOS consensus would mean. I mean, that seems very complex. The account permissions, the namespace, what is your username? How does that map to your account? The proof of stake system. Proof of stake is way more complicated than proof of work. All these things kind of coming together seem to make a very, very complicated piece of software. And if they can get it to run and get it to run stably, that would be a very impressive engineering feat.
So I guess in general, would you say that you're optimistic? How would you, in a sentence, what would your outlook be for the EOS project and the blockchain?
good luck, because if it works, it's going to be great.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I'm pretty, like I said, I'm fairly optimistic about it. There are a lot of details, and there's some of those details we're not going to know whether they work or not until we actually launch the EOS blockchain and we start developing apps on it. They are already in alpha, probably trying to get into beta soon. So people are already building applications on the EOS blockchain. Obviously, it's on testnet, not on mainnet. And one thing I will let the listeners know, building applications, especially if they're complex, take a lot longer than you guys want them to take. So it is something where even if they have a good framework for building decentralized applications, and even if people are building those applications now, in the beginning, they're probably going to be rough around the edges. They might be a little bit on the insecure side. As time goes on, they will mature. And hopefully if EOS is able to scale well, then hypothetically there could be a relatively large ecospace of decentralized apps that are running on EOS. And honestly, I am hoping for that, because I think as an app developer, that kind of it gets my imagination running. And in the back of my mind, I'm going to be keeping a close eye on this project, because and I'm sure you're the same, I've come up with ideas about applications that I would like to write, and to have a framework to build them is something that I certainly appreciate. So maybe one day I'll be developing on it. And I don't know, what do you think? Could you ever see yourself developing applications on EOS? Or
I definitely could, especially if it became popular. I mean, in a world where 99.9% of the coins out there are complete junk and scams and everything, this actually seems like one of the rare legitimate projects. I mean, they're really trying to do an advance in how smart contracts work and an advance in the ecosystem. So I'm actually really happy to see things like this come through.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would say that a lot of the ideas in it are relatively original, and a lot of them are kind of holdovers from, for example, BitShares and Steam, and that's because they have some of the same team members. But that also means that they have some of the wisdom they've learned from some of those earlier projects, and they're bringing that wisdom to this project. So I will also say that some of the team members, when I've heard them in interviews, the way that their values seem in line with a lot of the blockchain community, that does make me optimistic. So they do have quite a bit of experience behind them, and I think they have the tools to get it done. Now, whether the execution, how that will go, I guess we'll find out starting this June.
There's nothing like a good science experiment.
Okay, so there you go. There's our analysis of the EOS project. As we said, we're both looking forward to it. It launches in June. For those of you who want to get involved and actually want tokens, tokens on the official EOS blockchain, in order to do that, if you want that from the very beginning, you'll have to buy their ERC20 token and make sure that you register it. So, until next time, guys, this is your captain and William Swanson wishing you fair winds and following seas. Set sail.
Aye.